Welcome back, Travis Lowe, to Questioning Faith, episode 2. As you know, you are the teaching pastor.
So I've heard. Yeah.
And I'm Stephen Stow. I'm the communications director. And this is episode 2, so we're going to just dig right in.
Yeah.
Travis.
Yes.
Is the Sunday morning gathering for believers or unbelievers?
Good question. Yeah. So this question has risen to prominence uniquely, probably in the last 20 to 30 years, specifically through a movement known as the seeker-sensitive movement.
Yes, yes.
And I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Very familiar.
Probably
with it.
grew up during an era when this was being debated.
Indeed, I did.
But for those who are not familiar, basically the seeker-sensitive movement was championed by a number of churches, and the idea was we need to de-weird church. We need to make it less uncomfortable for somebody who doesn't have any sort of a religious background. And so
change the churchy vernacular,
right.
And some of that, which in its essence is not necessarily wrong.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we've created have indeed created obstacles to people coming to know Jesus.
Sure.
But some of those things are necessary.
Right. So I think the intention there was at least noble, right?
Okay.
The desire was, we want to see more people come to Jesus, but they have a hard time understanding what's going on a Sunday. So let's take away some of those obstacles. Let's get rid of some of the theological terminology that's confusing. And I get that impulse, and I want to affirm the goodness of that impulse, but I think it led to probably some really unhealthy approaches to church. And
rock songs on Sunday morning,
right? Yeah,
playing "Highway to Hell," from the stage,
in a worship service, let's just
yeah.
play like top 40 pop songs. And the whole idea was, let's make Christianity as unoffensive and unthreatening as possible, so that more people will come to church, and by virtue of that, more people will get saved. And the reason I bring this up is not to bash the seeker-sensitive movement, but to say the way they would have answered this question is Sunday morning is for non-believers.
Right.
Right. If you want to be deep at church, you need to go find a small group.
Right.
This is not for you. Sunday morning is not for you going deep. This is for people who don't know anything about Christianity.
100%. And I think a lot of churches still operate that way.
Yeah.
But there's some danger in that.
Yeah. I think, as noble as the intention is, I would pretty fundamentally disagree with that.
Okay.
While wanting to preserve maybe some of the intentions there. I think of 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is giving sort of structure to the Corinthian church and telling them how to run their assemblies when they gather together. And he says to them, you guys might want to rein it in on speaking in tongues. And this is a massive paraphrase, right? But yeah.
Not a quote.
No, not a direct quote, but he says you need to rein it in, calm down a little bit with the speaking in tongues, because if a non-believer is in your service, they're going to think you're out of your mind.
Right.
So Paul there, he assumes that there will be non-believers
in our midst.
Right? And he says, you need to kind of be sensitive to that.
Right.
What you do on Sunday needs to be comprehensible to somebody who doesn't yet understand the gospel. So in that regard, I think the seeker-sensitive movement is laying hold of something true and biblical. However, and this is my big however, the assembly of God's people from the Old Testament on is fundamentally a worshiping community.
Indeed.
It is fundamentally a worshiping community. We talked about Exodus in the last question, which came out last week, but for us was 10 minutes ago, right?
Right.
And what does God say to Pharaoh? Let my people go.
So that they can
worship me. Right?
Yeah.
So this question is Sunday morning for believers or unbelievers. I want to say the paradigm here is not quite right. There's a third option, which is Sunday morning is not first for believers or unbelievers, it's for God, right?
Okay.
Which feels like a Jesus juke, right? It feels like a...
Not as much, I feel like a no duh.
Right.
I feel like a grade school, oh yeah, no duh.
Right.
Yeah, but we don't often think of that. We think of how we're designing it to be comfortable for people, how we're designing it to be comfortable for guests, how we're designing it to be comfortable. In its services, are we asking that question?
Yeah.
Have we organized this in such a way that it glorifies God?
Right.
Is God not our focus for Sunday mornings? And it should be.
And I think the first question we ask on a Sunday morning is not what will reach people. The first question is, how does God desire to be worshiped?
Right.
If the fundamental purpose of us coming together is to worship God, how does God desire to be worshiped? And then after we answer that question, then we can say, okay, how do we approach this in a way that is understandable for the non-believer and edifying and convicting and encouraging for the Christian?
Right.
And here's the interesting thing that I've found is, I think about a lot of my friends, and I think about another podcast interview we did a while back with a guy named Jay Kim. He's a pastor out in California, and he had a friend who was a pretty popular EDM dubstep artist.
Oh wow!
And he never told us who it was. I don't know if it was like Skrillex or something like that. But this guy had grown up in the church and walked away from the faith and went back to a church that was very focused on being cool and being hip and being attractive to a non-believer. So they had, the smoky lights. It looked like a club. They had the music pounding. And this guy, who's a famous electronic music artist who plays clubs all the time, said, I didn't feel cool enough to go to that church. That church felt too cool for me. I felt left out.
Wow.
And here's the interesting thing about it. The harder we try to be cool by playing by the world's standards, actually the less relevant we are. Because what we end up doing is taking the world, wrapping it up in a Christian bow and trying to sell it back to itself.
And that just doesn't work.
It doesn't work, no.
I mean, every time I've seen us try to do something, I'm not making fun of my brothers and sisters who produce Christian movies.
Sure.
But very rarely do I see a movie produced with a distinctly Christian theme be good.
Sure.
Yeah. And one of the reasons is we're trying to produce art without producing.
We're trying to produce propaganda, not art. I think that's the challenge.
Thank you for that. That's actually what that is a better way of saying what I was trying to say. So that's great. Thank you.
So I think the same thing happens in church services. We try so hard to be cool to reach non-believers, and they see right through that, right? Like if what attracts somebody to your church is how great the rock band is, they can go up the road to Ybor and when concerts start happening again,
Sure,
and find a better rock band. Right?
Not a great choice, but you could go see Nickelback at the.
Oh, that's bleak. That's brutal. Oh gosh, that makes my heart sink. But
I knew that would get you.
Yeah.
But still, better rock than most places can produce on their own.
That is a scathing indictment of the church. but I think here's the reality. What captures people about Christianity is not us trying to outcool the world. What captures people about Christianity is the fact that Jesus has overcome the world. And if our worship services aren't bearing witness to that, you'll never see people reached for the gospel. No matter how cool you are, no matter how great your sound system is, that doesn't reach people long term. And so here's where I'm going with this. When we come back to the question, is the worship service for the believer or for the non-believer? I say first, it's for God. Second, it needs to be understandable for somebody who's not a Christian, and edifying and encouraging for the Christian. But here's the thing. If you make your primary focus on Sunday morning glorifying God, you will get both of those things. You will get something that edifies believers and convicts and challenges non-believers. And so if we aim for God rather than man,
then God brings heart change to all.
Yes. Yeah.
There you go.
So yeah, is the worship service for believers or unbelievers?
Yes.
It's for God. Yes.
It's for God.
It's for God.
And thus, yes.
Yeah. And the glory of God is man's highest good. And so when we aim to glorify God, we will find what Augustine found, that our restless hearts find rest. So
that's awesome. Well, thank you, Travis. Appreciate you joining us again for question 2 of season 2. And we'll see you next time.